alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Those words are some of the most famous in movie history, and they belong to Universal's mega-popular 1931 horror picture, Frankenstein. The Doctor and his monster were recognizable to audiences in some form since Mary Shelley's novel in 1818, followed by the many stage adaptations and handful of films that came out after. But Universal's take on Shelley's story is hands down the most well-known. How did the studio develop this instant hit? What went into the monster's iconic makeup? Another director and Bela Lugosi nearly had Frankenstein looking very different. What was their take? And how did director James Whale and star Boris Karloff come into the picture? Let's hook up those electrodes, harness some lightning, and bring this bad boy back to life to discover the answers. After a group of mourners leave the gravesite of a recently deceased loved one, a cemetery worker buries the coffin. Hiding nearby are Dr. Henry Frankenstein and his assistant, Fritz. Under the cover of night, they dig up the body to use in Henry's experiments. The doctor is obsessed with trying to reanimate dead tissue in order to create new life. Frankenstein's old mentor, Dr. Waldman, teaches a class comparing a healthy human brain to that of a criminal. In need of a mind for his creation, Henry sends Fritz to steal the healthy specimen, but in the process, the assistant accidentally destroys it and takes the criminal brain instead. Frankenstein's fiancée Elizabeth and best friend Victor are worried about the doctor and approach Waldman for help. Together, they travel to the abandoned old watchtower Henry is using as his lab and uncover his plan to bring life to the dead. The trio witness the culmination of Frankenstein's work. In spectacular fashion, the doctor succeeds in his goal. Later, the terrifying creature emerges, walking on its own. It can't speak and moves in a rigid way, but seems to dully understand some of what its creator instructs. Fritz immediately hates the monster and taunts it with fire. The danger of the creature's massive strength soon becomes apparent, and Frankenstein is forced to keep it locked in a dungeon. Fritz continues to torment the monster until it finally snaps. In 1818, Mary Shelley unleashed the Gothic horror novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. It's been a classic of English literature ever since and has become required reading in a lot of high school classrooms. The book bears very little resemblance to what pop culture accepts to be the dominant Frankenstein or his monster. Those deviations from Shelley's original story started with stage adaptations that began in 1823. Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, was the first recorded stage production based on Shelley's work. The author was actually able to attend a performance herself. It made many changes, including introducing the character of Fritz, Frankenstein's lab assistant, and crediting the actor portraying the monster with a simple question mark. Fritz and the question mark were both used in the Universal film. British playwright Peggy Webling adapted Frankenstein into a stage show in the 1920s and sent it over to producer Hamilton Dean. Dean also led the Dracula play that Universal modeled their 1931 film after. The producer debuted Webling's production in 1927 and again in 1930. Dean even played the creature himself. Webling's play and others began referring to Frankenstein's monster as Frankenstein, naming the creature after its creator. John L. Balderston soon adapted Webling's work for American audiences, just as he did with Dracula several years earlier. However, that version of the play never saw the stage, as Universal bought the rights to it in 1931. They paid $20,000 plus 1% of the movie gross for both Webling and Balderston's versions. In terms of film, Frankenstein was given the celluloid treatment several times before the 1930s. A silent short by Edison Studios in 1910 was likely the first. Considering the time period, this is pretty darn good. They reversed a shot of a dummy burning to visualize the monster's creation. It was a striking image. 1915's Life Without Soul was a silent feature very loosely interpreting the original source material, and there was a 1921 Italian picture called The Monster of Frankenstein that did the same. Both those films have unfortunately been lost. With the success of Dracula, studio owner Carl Laemmle had gained confidence in his son Carl Jr. to continue producing horror films for Universal. Frankenstein was the next logical choice. Despite its success on the stage, some within the company didn't think Frankenstein was an adaptable property. Universal was able to take advantage of the shortcuts the stage productions made, combined with their own creatives' visions, to produce a coherent and understandable 70-minute feature film. Jr. gave directing duties to Robert Florey. Involved in the writing process with Dracula's Todd Browning and Garrett Fort, Florey's conceptualization of the project got pretty far. Bela Lugosi was announced to be playing the monster as late as April 1931, but everything fell apart before principal photography could begin. An infamous 20-minute test shoot transpired on one of the old Dracula sets, featuring Dwight Frye as Fritz, Edward Van Sloan as Dr. Waldman, and Bela Lugosi in full monster makeup. It ended up being a disaster. Lugosi didn't want to play the mostly mute creature after his role as the charismatic Count Dracula, and the early makeup apparently made Laemmle Jr. laugh like a hyena. It had the monster looking more like the Golem of Germany's silent cinema than what would come along later. It's unconfirmed if Lugosi turned down the role or he was let go after Jr. saw the footage, but Bela wouldn't portray Frankenstein's monster until years later. Also unclear were the circumstances around Robert Florey's removal from the project. The underwhelming test footage seemed to be the final nail in the coffin, and Jr. was soon on the hunt for another director. Florey still received a credit on the French poster for the finished film, and some of his ideas were implemented. He stayed with the studio to direct 1932's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which starred Bela Lugosi. Jr. settled on director James Whale to replace Florey. Whale at first was resistant to the project, but soon realized he could use Frankenstein to emulate some of his favorite films in an expressionistic style. Jr. brought back Garrett Fort for rewrites. One of Whale's main objectives was to have the monster come off more sympathetic than previous drafts. When Fort left the project, Francis Edward Faragoh was pulled in to finish up the screenplay. On the casting front, Leslie Howard was in consideration for Henry Frankenstein, but Whale demanded an actor he recently worked with named Colin Clive. Mae Clark, who played Elizabeth, led the cast of Whale's previous film to Frankenstein, Waterloo Bridge. Dwight Frye as Fritz and Edward Van Sloan as Dr. Waldman were retained from Robert Florey's screen test. That left the question of who would fill the shoes of the creature itself. By 1931, William Henry Pratt, stage name Boris Karloff, was 44 years old and a screen veteran, appearing in about 80 films across a long career, but he wasn't a name actor. There are a couple different stories on how he got the part of Frankenstein's monster. One that's repeated often is that James Whale spotted him at the Universal Lot Commissary and liked his bone structure. After calling him over for a short conversation, he invited him to screen test for the role. In contrast to his most well-known performance, Karloff was a cultured, well-read English gentleman. According to his daughter Sarah, Boris's feelings were a bit hurt because he was trying to look presentable that day in one of his best suits, and Whale clocked him for the part of a grotesque creature. Still, he accepted the role. I mentioned makeup artist Jack Pierce back in my The Man Who Laughs review. His design for the monster is probably the most widely recognized makeup job in Hollywood history. Pierce later said the final look was a compromise between him and James Whale, but Jack was the guy who made it happen. The flat head was partially inspired by the monster from Edison's 1910 short film, but it was a practical choice for the character of Henry to hypothetically pop open the skull and place a brain inside. Karloff himself suggested the heavy eyelids to make the monster look less alive. Pierce achieved this with mortician's wax. Boris also removed the bridge from his mouth and sucked in his right cheek to give his face a more lopsided appearance. Pierce then darkened Karloff's fingertips to simulate blood that had settled in the extremities. The costume included a pair of 13-pound cumbersome boots, a suit with shortened arms that was supposed to be an old jacket of the Henry character, padding all around the upper body, steel struts in the pants, and more. In all, Karloff was boosted to 7 feet tall and wore 48 pounds on top of him. Despite being so covered up in makeup and padding, the actor's performance shines through like a beacon. His facial expressions and movements made the character what it was. The head and front brow consisted of cotton, spirit gum, and collodion plastic. The smell was strong. It was uncomfortable to wear and painful to remove. Karloff said it took 4 to 6 hours a day to apply the makeup and 90 minutes to 2 hours to get it off. The actor was overworked on set, putting in 15 to 16-hour days. This violated the Academy's rule of 12 hours per day for actors. After Boris appealed to the Academy about the situation, Laemmle Jr. shortened his workday toward the end of the shoot. The challenging production took its toll on Karloff. He lost 25 pounds, developed scars on the sides of his neck from the electrodes, and had back problems for the rest of his life because of the physical nature of the role and James Whale's demanding directing style. Whale sometimes insisted on dozens of takes that resulted in injury, and Karloff used no stuntman. Even Colin Clive had his arm dislocated during one of the on-screen scuffles. Whale was deeply involved in every aspect of production. While some of the Gothic sets were in line with Robert Florey's original designs, Whale and his team more than made them their own. Cinematographer Arthur Edison and art director Charles D. Hall were told to reinforce the film's German expressionistic roots, and that really comes across in the long shadows and slanted backgrounds. The electrical equipment used by Frankenstein in his lab is forever tied to the identity of this movie too. It was all provided and operated by a Santa Monica inventor named Kenneth Strickfaden. Strickfaden created the equipment for the 1930 science fiction film Just Imagine, and it was used in other movies up through the 1970s. Mel Brooks even hired Strickfaden to operate the same machines in Young Frankenstein. 1931's Frankenstein was given a budget of $262,000 and began a planned 30-day shoot on August 24th. Somewhat like Dracula, it was filmed mostly in continuity with each scene. Finishing 5 days over schedule and $30,000 over budget, Universal was about to find out that they'd make that money back in spades. The monster finally gets a hold of Fritz and hangs him in the dungeon. After another tussle with Frankenstein and Waldman, the doctors decided best to destroy the creature. The regretful creator lapses into a nervous breakdown and is taken home, while Waldman attempts to dissect the grotesque being. However, Frankenstein's mentor is killed by the monster before he can complete his task. Soon after, and unaware of the creature's persistence, Henry and Elizabeth proceed with their wedding day. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the monster's innocent nature is brought forth when he befriends a little girl named Maria. Their pleasant interaction turns deadly when the creature tosses Maria into a lake. Thinking she'll float like the flowers they just threw in, he inadvertently drowns the little girl. Stories of Walden's death and the monster's violent exchanges with people on the mountainside reach Frankenstein, and he locks Elizabeth in a room for her own safety. Yet, the creature climbs in through the window and attacks her, fleeing before help can arrive. In the village, Maria's father approaches the burgomaster with his daughter's dead body, demanding retribution. The villagers share his sentiment, and teams are formed to search out and take down the monster. Eventually, their target is located. Creature clashes with Creator. The monster takes Henry to a windmill, with the torch-bearing villagers chasing close behind. Frankenstein is overpowered by the creature and thrown from the top of the structure. Henry is severely hurt, but alive. The villagers then set the windmill aflame, trapping the monster inside and finally ending Frankenstein's wild experiment. On Friday, December 4th, 1931, at Times Square's Mayfair Theater, the monster terrorized movie screens for the first time in wide release. Frankenstein was a massive and immediate success, both commercially and critically. Audiences were taken with the horrific story of the Mad Doctor and his gnarled but sympathetic creation. Critics' praise was abundant as well, with the New York Times naming it as one of the 10 best movies of the year. In its first domestic release, Frankenstein grossed over $1 million, which was past double of Dracula's financial take. Another similarity to Dracula, but even more so, was the positive reaction of children to Karloff's monster. Kids seem to relate to the character as an innocent caught up in a world he doesn't fully understand, failed by his creator. This younger demographic ensured Frankenstein's success for the long haul. While the movie did become a smash hit, it still upset what we'll call certain groups. The movie was previewed in Santa Barbara, California in October of 1931, and the audience's reaction was said to be that of stunned silence. They were overwhelmed by what they experienced, with a big sticking point being how grim the movie was. Universal took swift action. They ordered Edward Van Sloan's intro at the top of the film, warning people of what they were about to watch.
If you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now's your chance to, well, we've warned you.
Van Sloan also closed out Dracula with a similar scene, but the one in Frankenstein is still attached to the movie today. Universal also added a scene that confirmed Henry's survival after being thrown from the windmill. Originally, both he and the monster were to perish. That final sequence with Henry's father gleefully drinking to his son's well-being has always felt out of place. The natural ending point was absolutely the burning windmill. Colin Clive wasn't actually in the scene either, as he was back in England when the sequence was being shot. He's replaced with a stand-in in the background. Other scenes were slightly altered, but the most important one was that of the monster and Maria, the little girl the creature accidentally kills. There was apparently a closer shot of her drowning in the water that was trimmed out of the final movie. However, the alterations to this scene didn't end there. It was cut entirely in some areas. In others, they just saw the monster reach for her before going to the following scene. Considering the state we see Maria in next, I think this makes her fate much darker. The implication of what happened is too broad, and a reasonable viewer would be justified in thinking it was a much more violent end. This also takes away from the monster's sympathetic nature. This sequence was a battle on set as well. Karloff wanted to preserve the monster's pathos and felt tossing the little girl into the drink was too much. The crew agreed with him, and he pitched gently placing her into the lake instead. Perhaps the girl would even survive the incident. But James Whale was adamant that this tragedy needed to unfold the way it was written. The director famously responded, "You see, it's all part of the ritual." Karloff accepted Whale's reasoning, and they went ahead as planned. Marilyn and Boris got along well. I'm sure their friendship came in handy when they had to throw her into the water twice after hoping for one take. She didn't sink the first time, and Whale asked the actress what she wanted to let them retake the splash. Harris responded with a dozen hard-boiled eggs. They reset, dried off Marilyn, and successfully completed the retake. The next day, the director left 24 eggs for her. Maybe that made up for how badly Harris's back hurt from staying limp while later being carried by Maria's on-screen father. While partially edited out in certain releases, Universal eventually fully restored the lake scene. Same goes for this Frankenstein line.
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
Religious groups objected to Henry's blasphemous comparison to God, and they cut this line on reissues of the film, or covered it up with thunder. It also was restored in its entirety on later home releases. Censorship for Frankenstein was more widespread in other domestic areas and overseas. The Kansas State Board of Censors banned the film until 4 more cuts were made to the original edit. In Providence, Rhode Island, some papers refused to run ads featuring the monster's face. They claimed it was too excessive. In England, censors cut the scene showing Fritz's body hanging from his whip and the scene where the monster attacks Elizabeth. There were even some countries who rejected the film outright. There's no doubt Karloff's performance led the way for Frankenstein to become a cultural phenomenon. The idea of the monster garnering sympathy from the audience is well executed, and it's all exemplified in what's been described by many as silent film acting in a sound picture. In contrast, the creature from Mary Shelley's book becomes a very well-spoken character through distance learning. His hatred of his creator is much more direct since he's intelligent enough to speak about it. A lot. While completely different in many ways, Shelley's novel really is worth a read or listen. There's plenty about the original story I like better than the movie, but there's no arguing which is more popular. If you'd like to see a film closer to what the book presented, there's 1994's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, starring and directed by Kenneth Branagh. It features Robert De Niro as the creature. The movie gets pretty bonkers in certain scenes and with how it's shot, so if you want to give it a look, prepare yourself.
We've warned you.
Also, I have to point out how much of a better name Victor Frankenstein is than Henry Frankenstein. Fortunately, I think most people are familiar with Victor as the lead character. Here, they modeled the name switch after Peggy Webling's play, where Victor's first name is swapped with his friend Henry. Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein had the necessary guilty conscience mixed with inherent darkness to pull off the starring role. Some of my favorite scenes with him are quieter moments.
Crazy, am I? We'll see whether I'm crazy or not. You never wanted to look beyond the clouds and the stars, or to know what causes the trees to bud, and what changes the darkness into light. But if you talk like that, people call you crazy.
James Whale added that last exchange late in the process, and it really gets you on Henry's side, even though what he's doing isn't exactly responsible. The rest of the cast delivers adequate turns as their respective characters. A standout once again was Dwight Fry as Fritz. The assistant was mute in the play and early incarnations of the script, but Fry was able to do a lot with the dialogue he was given. James Whale took a liking to him and cast the actor in future films. Edward Van Sloan was as reliable as ever as the authority figure, Dr. Waldman. He didn't quite have the extra sass Van Helsing did in Dracula, but he's memorable enough as Henry's old mentor. I feel like Mae Clarke wasn't quite given enough to do as Elizabeth. She's very watchable, but I could have stood to see her involvement increased. In the novel, the character's relationship with Frankenstein is much more layered. There are hints of something deeper here with John Bowles as the Victor Moritz character, but their sort of forbidden connection in other script drafts wasn't elaborated on in the final movie. It's impossible to understate how incredible Frankenstein looks. Every set offers a view into an off-kilter world that is engrossing to watch and easy to get swept up in. The climax with the villagers and their torches chasing down the monster reminded me strongly of The Man Who Laughs, especially in the village set. Seeing that windmill burn down is still the pinnacle of the excellent black and white cinematography. We're never explicitly told when or exactly where the film takes place, but as film historian Sir Christopher Frayling says in his commentary, that vagueness only adds to its fairy tale mystique. Common for the era, there's almost no music in the film. What we do have is the Bernard Kahn theme from the title card. There's also a little ditty at the end, but Frankenstein has so many loud scenes from the monster's creation to the villager's hunt, I didn't notice the lack of music like I did in Dracula. Minus the charismatic presence of Bela Lugosi, Frankenstein is just a more exciting, emotionally investing, and fun film. It's still exciting to watch. Now, I do believe 1935's Bride of Frankenstein ups the ante and delivers an even better movie, utilizing more storylines from the book. Karloff, Clive, Fry in a different role, and director James Whale returned for the sequel, but Universal couldn't have gotten there without the 1931 original. Boris Karloff would go on to become a huge star for the studio, starring in many more films and achieving legendary status in his later years. While he may have been a bit typecast in horror films, the actor had no problem with it. He remarked about how lucky he was to have work and to have left his mark. The role of Frankenstein's monster is one he was grateful for the rest of his life. Another shout out to the 4K Blu-ray for the ridiculous amount of information mentioned here. There's a ton more that I couldn't fit in, so if you're interested, pick it up. Also, check out my personal channel, Walter Culture, for more content. And join us next time. We're taking Juniversal on the road, baby. You don't want to miss it.
Here's to a son, to the house of Frankenstein.
Wow.